Well, hello and welcome to the first of our mini lectures on alcohol. So, alcohol is a really interesting, dangerous drug for us to discuss here in this class because many of us don't really think of it that way when we talk about health studies of dangerous drugs. It's not always one that hits the list for a lot of us. And we really do have this very interesting cultural dichotomy about how we treat alcohol here in the United States. So we've got these two images. We've got our very sophisticated, most interesting man in the world drinking a beer over here, and then we've got our homeless guy over here drinking the same beverage. And there really is not another drug here in the United States, at least, that has the same connections both with sophistication and with devastation. So it's a really interesting cultural phenomenon that we have all of these connections with the same drug. So if you're keeping track on the study guide, the first couple of slides that we'll be going through will kind of be more framing our cultural references, and we will not be recording anything on the study guide. I'll let you know when that picks back up again. All right, so we've got our cultural images of sophistication. We've also got a lot of humor associated with alcohol use. So we've got jokes about whether somebody is addicted to wine or is an alcoholic. If we think about maybe joking about whether somebody's addicted to heroin or to prescription drugs, you can see how this is just a really different approach. We've got lots of different jokes about whether or not somebody's an alcoholic, whether they've got a drinking problem. And then we've got this even mocking of the idea of AA, that that there's a way to have an alcohol problem that involves having a lot of fun. So here's that idea again that being an alcoholic is something to joke about. And then speaking of fun, we've got our gentleman over here who seems to be having a really good time. And while images like this are posted to, in some ways, to mock the individual in the picture, we tend not to look at this picture and think of an alcoholic or somebody who's dependent on alcohol or somebody who's a problem drinker. We tend to look at this picture and think of somebody who's having fun. So again, that interesting cultural dichotomy about how we approach alcohol and alcohol dependence here in the United States. And then, of course, we have commercial sponsors. We've got celebrities who endorse particular brands of alcohol. So if you try to think about maybe celebrities endorsing a particular brand of heroin, again, we start to see that really different cultural attitude about alcohol use and abuse here. Now, of course, we do have some disturbing imagery related to alcohol abuse as well. I think most of us in the room know somebody who's been involved in some kind of a or been involved or injured in some kind of DUI-related accident, possibly some of us even know somebody who's died in that kind of accident. And then we've got this kind of dangerous imagery up on the right that we're pretty familiar with, that consuming alcohol on a regular basis has some pretty devastating biological effects, neurological ones. We've got a whole ad campaign dedicated to helping people who are problem drinkers to get access to resources to help. And then we've even got over here our friend Robert Downey Jr. as a celebrity sponsor of not drinking. So it's a really, it's an unusual approach to a dangerous drug, and really the only drug that we'll look at over the course of the semester that we treat this way. So when we talk about alcohol and its prevalence in our society, and the different kinds of attitudes that we have about how people use and abuse alcohol, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that it is our oldest and most widely used psychoactive drug. Last month, around the world, 2 billion people, so about 2/7 of the world population, drank alcohol. About 17 million people here in the United States are considered heavy drinkers when we do surveys. And alcohol and alcohol consumption appears in the Bible. It appears in ancient Greek literature and in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. So alcohol and alcohol consumption has been around for a long time, and its consumption is very, very widespread. Around the world, like we said, 2 billion people consume alcohol. Alcohol consumption is legal for some portions of the population in most non-Islamic countries. Our highest rate per capita of alcohol consumption we see in Russia, but we see changing trends around the world over the past couple of decades with changes in economic standards. China's consumption of alcohol has doubled, and India's has increased by 50%. So some pretty dramatic changes in other parts of the world as well. Again, around the world, 76 million people suffer from some kind of alcohol consumption disorder, and 2 million people die every year due to the direct effects of alcohol. So this isn't the indirect or behavioral toxicity of alcohol consumption, but direct physiological toxicity. We do know that around the world, 10% of all diseases and injuries result directly from alcohol abuse. And it has a strong tie to homeless populations. In a country like Japan, which has a very strong social safety net, 75% of the people who still end up homeless are alcoholics or problem drinkers. So some interesting international trends to consider. And then here in the United States, just in the last month, 129 million of us, so about a third of the population, had at least one drink. And that's 52% of the population over 12. We know that about 70% of students at four-year colleges had at least one drink in the last month, and $75 billion was spent on alcohol here in the United States. So it's a very important economic force as well here in the U.S. And in the last month, about 5% of 8th graders, 15% of sophomores in high school, and about over a quarter of high school seniors were drunk. So not just consumed a drink, but actually considered themselves drunk at some point in the last month. So again, if we think about the use of marijuana or heroin or other kinds of illicit drugs that we'll talk about this semester, we really have a unique approach and perception of alcohol consumption and problem drinking here in the U.S. and frankly around the world. We know that about 130,000 people died last month as a direct result of alcohol consumption, and that a quarter of hospital admissions had a direct or indirect relationship to alcohol. So this could be either the physiological effects of consuming alcohol or some of the behavioral effects that may come with that. And then this is a one that tends to give people a bit of a surprise, is that about half of all murder victims and all murderers were drinking at the time of the crime. And we'll talk a bit more about alcohol's effect on inhibition and how that might be involved later in our lectures. And we do know that more than half of all rapes last month involved alcohol. Alcohol abuse and dependence, it's extremely expensive. This is not over a month, this is over the past decade. Alcohol abuse and dependence cost businesses, the judicial system, medical facilities, and the federal government more than $184 billion. And this comes down to $638 for every resident of the United States. So a very expensive problem as well as widespread. All right, so now we'll pick back up with your study guide, if you're following along and completing that to prepare for our next exam. And we're going to start with talking about how alcohol is produced. And basically all alcohol is produced by fermentation. And as you read about in your text, this is the production of alcohol from sugar through the action of yeasts. The raw materials need to include some kind of sugar, such as a fruit, if it's going to ferment just with the addition of yeast. If it's going to be based on a cereal grain, then it's going to require malt to convert that starch into sugar. Now, one of the reasons why we see particular amounts of alcohol in particular drinks is because of this idea that yeast has a limited tolerance for alcohol. So when the concentration of alcohol in the beverage reaches 12 to 15%, the yeast is going to die, so fermentation will stop. And if we're looking at for a higher percentage of alcohol, other kinds of production processes will be used. But for beer and wine, this is why there's a limit on the amount of alcohol that's contained in those products. So if the desired goal for the product is a higher level of alcohol content, then we move to the process of distillation. So basically the way distillation works is that the product is evaporated and then condensed, and this will increase the concentration of alcohol in the final product. This is not a new process. It was discovered in Arabia sometime around 800 AD. And it made its way into Europe in about the 10th century, so it didn't take too long for that process to spread around. And then we see the idea of alcoholic proof, or the measure of a beverage's alcohol content. Basically, proof is twice the percentage of alcohol by weight. So if we have a distilled beverage like whiskey, that's 45% alcohol, then we multiply that 45 by 2, and we end up with 90 proof whiskey. Of course, the higher that number is, the higher the alcohol content of the product. Talk about distilled spirits, or the products of that distillation process. Distillation creates grain neutral spirits. So the process creates a nearly pure alcohol, 190 proof, that's clear, tasteless, and nearly pure. If you've ever seen Everclear sold, or hopefully not consumed because it's very, very dangerous, it is this is what Everclear is. It's that grain neutral spirit, and then it is actually sold to manufacturers to make other beverages with. We see gin being created from grain neutral spirits. It's filtered through juniper berries and then diluted with water, so we don't see 190 proof gin, thank goodness. And then vodka, that grain neutral spirits mixed with water. So we see this as the basis for the distilled beverages that we drink. On its own, the grain neutral spirits contain relatively few congeners, and these are other alcohols and oils that are contained in alcoholic beverages, so that what will add the brownish color or particular flavors to a product. But grain neutral spirits on their own contain relatively few, relatively little amounts of congeners, and it's in the manufacturing process where those get added back. So this will wrap up our first lecture. We'll pick up in lecture 2 on alcohol with early U.S. views on alcohol use.